I don't know how to start this. I don't even know why I'm writing. I guess I need to tell someone else, even if it's strangers on the internet. I can't talk about this to my family or friends. They wouldn't understand, or worse, they would think I'm crazy. It all started a few weeks ago. I live in a small town, surrounded by woods and mountains. I've always been a guy who likes nature, so one day I decided to take a hike on one of the lesser-known trails. I wanted to clear my mind, to be alone with my thoughts for a while. The trail I chose was known to be long and off the beaten path, perfect for what I was looking for. I prepared myself with some supplies, my knife, you never know what you might find in the woods, and a small flashlight, in case the hike dragged on until dark. I started my hike early, with the sun just peeking over the mountains. The air was fresh and clean, and all was quiet, except for the sound of my footsteps and the occasional bird song. I walked for hours, enjoying the scenery and the solitude. I met no one along the way. As the sun moved across the sky, I began to feel a strange sensation, as if something was not right. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, being alone in the woods can play tricks on your mind. But then I started noticing little things. Branches that seemed to be intentionally placed, forming strange patterns. Markings on trees that didn't look natural. I chalked it up to hunters or maybe other hikers trying to mark the trail. The sun was starting to go down, and I should have started back. But my curiosity urged me to keep going. I wanted to see where those markers led. I followed the trail for what seemed like hours. It got darker and darker and the forest thicker and thicker. The feeling that something wasn't right was growing inside me. I began to hear strange noises. Not the typical sounds of the forest, but something different. Cracking, rustling noises that seemed to follow me. I stopped to turn on my flashlight, and at that moment, I saw it. Not far from where I was, there was a figure. I couldn't see well at first. It was just a shadow between the trees. But it was clearly looking at me. I stood still, watching, trying to see more details. When the light from my flashlight finally illuminated the figure, I realized it was a man. His clothes were torn, his eyes were wild, and in his hand he held something that glinted in the light of my flashlight. A knife. I didn't need to see any more. I turned and began to run as I had never run before. I could hear him behind me, his heavy footsteps breaking branches and dry leaves. I didn't know if I could get out of there. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. I ran without looking back, guided only by the light of the flashlight and my knowledge of the forest. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually, the sounds behind me began to fade. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of my town in the distance. Only when I got home did I allow myself to stop, lock the door and collapse, exhausted and terrified. Since that night, I haven't been back to the woods. I know I should tell someone, the police perhaps, but what would I say? That I saw a wild man in the woods with a knife? No one would believe me, so I keep it to myself, hoping I never have to go back to those lonely trails. And to anyone who might be reading this, I'm just saying, be careful. You never know what you might run into in the woods. But the memory of that night would not leave me alone. I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump out of bed, and every shadow seemed to move. The thought that this man might still be out there somewhere in the woods, or worse, that he might find his way to town, consumed me. After several days of mental torture, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't go on like this. I needed answers. Who was this man? What was he doing in the woods with a knife? And most importantly, was he a threat to the others? Armed with my knife and a more powerful flashlight, I decided to return to the forest. During the day, of course, I thought maybe I could find some clue as to who he was and what he wanted. I told a friend, without going into too much detail, that I was going for a hike and that if I didn't return before dark, he should worry. I entered the forest on the same trail as that night. Everything looked different in the daylight, less threatening, but I wasn't fooled. I knew what I had seen. I advanced to the place where I had first seen the man. In the daylight, I could see more clearly. There were signs that someone had been there, the remains of an old campfire, cans of food and pieces of old clothing. I continued to explore the area, looking for anything that might tell me more. As I surveyed, I found an unclear path leading away from the main trail. I decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me somewhere. The path became increasingly difficult, the vegetation denser. After about an hour of walking, the trail led to a small clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a hut. Old and dilapidated, it looked abandoned. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding. Each step seemed to echo for miles around. As I reached the door, I stopped to listen. Nothing. There was no sound. I pushed the door carefully. The inside was dark and smelled musty and earthy. My flashlight illuminated the room. There was a table, a couple of broken chairs, and an old mattress on the floor. But what really caught my attention was what was on the table. It was a pile of photos, some so old that the colors had faded. I picked one up to get a better look. It was a photo of a group of hikers, smiling at the camera, happy. I looked down at another photo and another. My breath quickened as I realized that all these photos had something in common. All the people in them had been reported missing for the past few years. Suddenly, a noise behind me made me jump. I turned quickly, knife in hand, ready to defend myself. But no one was there. Fear and adrenaline made me imagine things, I thought. Just as I was about to leave the cabin, I heard a definite, clear crack. Someone or something was outside. I approached the window slowly and looked out. There it was, a few feet from the cabin, the same figure from the other night, staring at me. This was what I had come to face, I told myself. I stepped out of the cabin and faced him, knife at the ready. But before I could get any closer, the man threw something at my feet. It was a diary, worn and dirty. Without letting my guard down, I picked it up. The man simply turned around and began to walk slowly away into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I opened the diary. The first page read in shaky letters, "To whoever finds this, these are the stories of those who can no longer tell them. Don't let their lives be forgotten." What I read next, each page, each story, was more horrifying than the last. Stories of people trapped, hunted, and finally, silenced in this very forest. Terror coursed through me as the pieces began to fit together. This place, this man, was part of something much bigger and darker than I could have ever imagined. And now I was part of it too.